Augustus never wanted Tiberius to become emperor, but in the end there was no way around it. He ended up becoming the second ruler of Rome. To understand how this happened, we need to go back in time. In 42 BC, it had only been a short time since Julius Caesar had been assassinated. Tiberius's father, Tiberius Claudius Nero, was an unstable man. At first he supported Caesar against Pompey, but later he praised the senators who had killed Caesar. And he didn't stop there. He even allied himself with Lucius Antonius, brother of Mark Antony, and started a rebellion against Octavian, the future Augustus. To do this, he gathered discontented army veterans. The result was a bloody war full of losses, including the death of Tiberius's grandfather. Defeated, Tiberius's father had to flee, first to Sicily, then to Greece. Meanwhile, Tiberius's mother, Livia Drusilla, was only 17 years old when she gave birth to him in November of 42 BC. She came from a powerful family, the important Claudian dynasty, which gave her far more prestige than her own husband. After years of hardship, in 39 BC, the family managed to return to Rome. But life was still difficult. They had little money, and many of their properties had been confiscated. Even so, they found a way to secure a brighter future for Tiberius. He was adopted by a wealthy senator, which opened doors for his public career. Around the same time, Livia became pregnant again and gave birth to another son, named Drusus. In other words, even before Tiberius became emperor, his life was already marked by escapes, losses, returns, and political alliances that would shape the destiny not only of himself, but of all of Rome. When Tiberius's family returned to Rome, life was still far from easy. On top of their financial struggles, another drama unfolded. Octavian, the future Augustus, fell in love with Livia, Tiberius's mother. And the most surprising part is that she began to fall for him as well. At that time, Livia was very young, not yet 20, while Octavian was 24. Her husband, Tiberius Claudius Nero, had already seen his career collapse and had no prospects. It's very likely that Livia realized her future with him would lead nowhere. Decisive as always, Octavian chose to divorce his wife Scribonia. What's curious is that in Rome divorce was very simple. A husband only needed to say something like, "Take your things and go." In Octavian's case, he even added a justification, saying he could no longer stand Scribonia's bitter temperament. Tiberius's father also divorced Livia, but in an amicable way. So in October of 39 BC, Livia was already engaged to Octavian and moved into his house. Shortly after, in January of 38 BC, Livia gave birth to Drusus. Since he was still the legitimate son of Claudius Nero, the baby was handed over to him to be raised. Just 3 days after giving birth, Livia and Octavian were married. A curious detail is that since Livia's father had already died and there were no close male relatives to accompany her, it was her ex-husband who escorted her to the ceremony. Years passed, and in 32 BC Tiberius's father died. With that, he and his brother Drusus went to live permanently with their mother and Augustus. In their new household also lived Julia, Augustus's daughter, and their cousin Marcellus. At age 13, Tiberius had his first great opportunity to appear before the Roman people. It was during Augustus's triumphal parade, celebrating victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra in the famous Battle of Actium. On that day, Tiberius rode on horseback alongside Augustus, drawing the eyes of all Rome, one of his very first memorable public appearances. Tiberius grew up in an environment where everything revolved around power and politics. Augustus, already in his 40s, was the great emperor of Rome, but his health began to weaken. He nearly died during one of these crises, and that made him think seriously about who would inherit his throne. Among the possible names were the young Tiberius and his brother Drusus. At 17, Tiberius was already being prepared for that role. Augustus placed him under his direct protection and introduced him to politics with the position of quaestor, an important office, especially for someone so young. More than that, he was granted privileges that few enjoyed. He was allowed to run for positions such as praetor and consul before reaching the legal minimum age. By the time he was not yet 20, Tiberius was already commanding an army. Just imagine, such a young man leading thousands of Roman soldiers into battle. His great trial by fire came when he had to face the Parthians, a powerful empire that had previously defeated Roman battles and even captured the legionary standards, symbols of the legion's honor. Around 20 BC, at only 22 years old, Tiberius set out for the east alongside Augustus. The mission was clear: to restore Rome's honor. Instead of relying only on violence, Tiberius showed he also knew how to negotiate. In Armenia, he managed to turn the kingdom into an ally of Rome, and after many delicate talks, he secured an agreement that restored neutrality to the region and guaranteed Roman prestige without the need for a massive war. While Drusus, his brother, was adored by the soldiers for being friendly, approachable, and charismatic, Tiberius had a different posture. He was rigid, serious, and kept his distance from the troops. This made him more respected than loved. The soldiers saw in him discipline and firmness, but not the warmth that Drusus inspired. In other words, from a very young age, Tiberius was already showing the world who he was: a cold, calculating, and strategic leader. He might not have been the most beloved, but he was certainly the kind of man Rome needed in times of crisis. Drusus, Tiberius's brother, was in the middle of a campaign in Germania when tragedy struck. He fell from his horse and died. For Rome, it was a huge shock, but for Tiberius it was even more painful, because despite being a cold man, he was very close to his brother. Even so, Tiberius did not allow himself to fall into excessive mourning. He believed that showing grief in public would be seen as a sign of weakness, and weakness was something he never wanted to display. With discipline, he escorted Drusus's body back to Rome. Along the way, he took part in the tributes and also received recognition for his own military victories. From that moment on, he stepped into his brother's place in Germania, continuing the work Drusus had begun. This loss, however, had an impact far beyond the personal. Drusus had been one of the names considered to inherit Augustus's throne. With his death, he became the third major figure lost among the possible successors. Before him, Agrippa and Marcellus, Augustus's nephew, had already died. Now, with yet another candidate out of the picture, Tiberius moved to the center of the succession. His successful campaigns in both Germania and Pannonia strengthened his image as a strong and strategic leader, making him increasingly seen as Augustus's natural heir. As Tiberius grew as a leader, his military victories and political offices placed him more and more in the spotlight. To strengthen his position, he also built alliances through marriage. That was how he married Vipsania, the daughter of the powerful general Agrippa. They got along well, and Tiberius truly loved her. But when Agrippa died, Augustus decided to change Tiberius's destiny. Harshly, he forced him to divorce Vipsania, even though she was pregnant at the time, so that he could marry Julia, Augustus's own daughter and Agrippa's widow. For Tiberius, this was a devastating blow, but he had no choice. Although he suffered from losing the woman he loved, this new marriage placed him even closer to the throne. Now, as the emperor's son-in-law, his position in the line of succession became much stronger. At the same time, his victories in Germania increased his fame, earning him not only respect in Rome, but also prestige as one of the most powerful men in the empire. In 6 BC, Augustus decided to grant Tiberius a great power, the tribunician power, which in practice gave him almost the same authority as the emperor himself. But behind this gift, there was a hidden strategy. Augustus wanted to send Tiberius far away, to the eastern provinces of the empire, while his grandsons Gaius and Lucius rose to prominence in Rome and began to be seen as the natural successors. The plan was simple: remove Tiberius so the two young men could shine without competition. But Augustus did not expect his stepson's reaction. Tiberius refused the mission. That's right, he said no to the emperor. The response hit like a bomb. Augustus was furious, felt betrayed, and even took the matter to the Senate, complaining that Tiberius had abandoned him at a decisive moment. Why did Tiberius do this? There are two possible explanations. The first is that he was deeply unhappy in his forced marriage to Julia, Augustus's daughter, and no longer had peace at home. The second is that he realized clearly that no matter what he did, Augustus would always favor his grandsons Gaius and Lucius as heirs to the throne. Feeling cast aside, Tiberius decided to turn his back on Rome. Tired of the pressures in Rome and seeing no future in the succession, Tiberius made a radical decision. He exiled himself to the island of Rhodes in Greece. It was a turning point in his life. Far from power and the imperial court, he chose to live in isolation, away from the intrigues that dominated Rome. While Tiberius tried to find peace in Rhodes, Augustus continued to elevate his grandsons, Gaius and Lucius, granting them privileges that went far beyond the ordinary. Tiberius, in turn, realized more and more that he was being left aside. In the midst of this, news reached him that struck him deeply. His wife Julia, daughter of Augustus, had been accused of immoral conduct. The emperor himself decided to punish her, banishing her from Rome and condemning her to exile. Later, Julia would die of starvation in that isolation in 14 AD, which only deepened the emotional distance between Augustus and Tiberius. Between 2 and 1 BC, Tiberius tried to return to Rome, but Augustus denied his request. He remained stuck in Rhodes against his will, unable to resume his political life. Historians describe this period as the darkest chapter of Tiberius's career. His statues in Rome were torn down, his reputation collapsed, and the hostility against him grew so intense that his very life was at risk. After spending years in isolation on Rhodes, Tiberius finally managed to return to Rome in 2 AD. The one who allowed his return was Gaius, Augustus's grandson, but there was a condition. Tiberius could not hold public office or wield direct political influence. He was back in the city, but still on the margins of power. But Rome was a city where everything changed very quickly. Not long after Tiberius's return, tragedy struck the imperial family. First, Lucius, one of Augustus's favorite grandsons, died in Miletus from an illness. A few years later, Gaius, the other grandson, suffered a wound in battle in Armenia and also died. These two deaths completely changed the game of succession. Without the heirs Augustus had so carefully prepared, all eyes began to turn back to Tiberius, who until then had seemed discarded. At the time, rumors spread that Livia, Augustus's wife and Tiberius's mother, had plotted to clear the path for her son. Many believed she might have been involved in these mysterious deaths. It is impossible to confirm whether this is true, but the fact is that Augustus's family was marked by many premature losses. And in the midst of this climate of mourning and uncertainty, Tiberius's name began to shine once again as the most likely option to take the throne. When the deaths of Augustus's grandsons completely changed the course of succession, the emperor realized he needed to act quickly to secure Rome's stability. He then made a decisive move. He brought Tiberius back to the center of power and restored to him the tribunician power, which gave him authority almost equal to that of Augustus. But he didn't stop there. To consolidate the succession once and for all, Augustus decided to adopt Tiberius as his legal son. From that moment on, he became known as Tiberius Julius Caesar, officially entering the imperial lineage. However, there was a condition. Tiberius also had to adopt Germanicus, the son of his late brother Drusus. Even though Tiberius already had a biological son named Drusus, he was forced to accept. Germanicus had noble blood on every side. He was the grandson of Mark Antony and Octavia, Augustus's sister. At the time of the adoption, Germanicus was probably around 18 years old. The name he inherited seemed almost prophetic, because as an adult, he would become one of Rome's most beloved generals, achieving brilliant victories in Germania and honoring the legacy of his father. This network of adoptions created by Augustus was a brilliant political maneuver. On one hand, it strengthened Tiberius as his official successor. On the other, it ensured that the next generation was also secured through Germanicus, who united two powerful bloodlines, that of Drusus and that of Augustus's own family. While his time to sit on the throne had not yet arrived, Tiberius continued to prove his worth on the battlefield. First, he consolidated his leadership in Germania, but in 6 AD a new challenge emerged, a massive revolt in Pannonia. When he took command, Tiberius adopted a cautious approach. Some critics said he was taking too long to act, but this patience was exactly what made the difference. He preferred to protect his soldiers rather than give in to the pressure for immediate victories. And his strategy worked. In 8 AD, Rome achieved a decisive victory, and Tiberius came out of it with his reputation even stronger as a master of discipline and strategy. When he returned to Rome, he was received as a hero. Augustus realized there was no longer any doubt. Tiberius was the natural successor. In 12 AD, he was granted powers equal to those of the emperor himself. The following year, in 13 AD, Tiberius became co-regent, officially sharing command of the empire with Augustus. But the great turning point came on August 19, 14 AD. On that day, Augustus died at the age of 75, after decades shaping the destiny of Rome. His body was cremated with full honors, and the Senate declared him a divinity. In his will, he made it clear Tiberius would be his sole legitimate heir. Thus, at the age of 55, Tiberius finally became emperor. The transition took place smoothly, with no rivals capable of challenging him. But along with the crown came the enormous weight of succeeding Augustus, the man who had brought Rome to the height of its glory. And this is where a new chapter of history begins. The reign of Tiberius, filled with tough decisions, conspiracies, and moments that would forever mark the Roman Empire. If you've made it this far, it means you love diving into the stories that shaped Rome's destiny. Don't miss this opportunity. Subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell so you won't miss the upcoming episodes. In the next videos, you'll discover the secrets, conspiracies, and battles that defined the reign of Tiberius. And I guarantee every detail is more surprising than you can imagine.